Hello, my name is David King, and this is my website, Unique Bible Answers, non-traditional answers to common Bible questions. Today, I would like to answer the question, where did God come from? How did the Trinity first come into existence? A more specific way to ask this question is, how could an eternal God with no beginning ever come into existence in the first place and still be eternal with no beginning? In other words, where did God come from? Also, how did the inseparable Trinity ever become an inseparable Trinity in the first place? For more than 50 years, I have asked myself these questions and asked God for the answers. Well, I finally have an answer that I will share with you during this YouTube video. It may not be the right answer, but I guarantee that you will never have heard of this answer before. And although my answers have a scientific basis, a biblical basis, and a logical basis, and to my knowledge, also have the virtue of never having been presented before, they could still be wrong. You'll just have to listen to my reasoning and decide for yourself. That being said, let's begin. I believe the answer to the origin of an eternal God with no beginning and the origin of the Trinity is directly related to another question. Can God create time? Although God can manipulate time now that time already exists, the question remains, could God have created time in the first place? Because if God could never have created time in the first place, then after a few simple steps of logic, you will discover for yourself how an eternal God with no beginning could have come into existence in the first place and still be eternal with no beginning. And at the same time, you will also solve the mystery of the Trinity by knowing how the inseparable Trinity became an inseparable Trinity in the first place. Now at this point, many of you are already thinking, this guy's YouTube video is worthless. After all, if something is eternal, then it cannot possibly have a beginning. And if something has a beginning, then it cannot possibly be eternal. So there is no way anyone can ever explain how an eternal God with no beginning could have come into existence in the first place and still be eternal with no beginning. Well, I used to believe that and teach that. But then I discovered that there is actually one exception to that rule. Now you are also probably thinking, besides, by definition, an all-powerful God can do anything, so he certainly could have created time. Yeah, I used to believe that too. Now the church teaches that God created all things, including time itself. And I have believed and taught that all my adult life. But in November of 2014, I finally recognized that God could never have created time, for the same reason that God could never have created himself. And this problem cannot be overcome simply by claiming that God is outside of time or claiming that God transcends time. You see, it is a logical impossibility for God to have created time in the first place, because creating time requires time to exist during the creating and to not exist at that very same moment, during which time still needs to be created because time does not yet exist. In other words, if time did not yet exist, in order for God to create time in the first place, a moment in time must already exist during which God recognizes his need to create time. A second moment in time must already exist during which God designs a plan to create time. And a third moment in time must already exist during which God implements his plan to create time. And all three of these moments in time must exist precisely at a time when time does not yet exist, in order for time to still need to be created. And this unsolvable paradox doesn't disappear simply by claiming God is outside of time or God transcends time. Because no matter what dimension we imagine God to be in when God is outside of time, God still cannot create time in that imaginary dimension unless time already exists in that imaginary dimension. Because creating time in any dimension will always require time to exist and not exist at the very same moment in that very same dimension, thereby violating the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction states that something cannot be both true and not true at the same time, in the same context, in the same sense. For the same reason that God could never have created time, God could never have created himself either, for that would require God himself to exist in order to do the creating and not exist at the very same moment, in order for that non-existing God to still need to be created. This second scenario also violates the law of non-contradiction. So if God was ever outside of time, in a place where time itself did not yet exist, then God would literally never have the time to create time in the first place, in order to have the time later on to do anything else. It should be self-evident, therefore, that without the previous existence of time itself, God would be, quote, frozen in time, unquote, so to speak, and would not be able to create anything, do anything, or even think anything, because even an instantaneous creation still requires a moment in time to exist during the instant of creation as well as before the instant of creation when the newly created thing did not yet exist. And you cannot get around this argument simply by saying God is all-powerful and so God can do anything. Otherwise, using that logic, God should be able to create himself without requiring God to exist and not exist at the very same moment. Most Christians recognize that God could never have created himself because that would require God to exist and to not exist at the same moment, which is a logical impossibility. Yet 100% of those same Christians who believe that God could never have created himself still believe that God could and did create time, even though creating time requires time itself to exist and not exist at the very same moment, which is also a logical impossibility. In fact, it is the identical logical impossibility. So if God could never have created himself under any circumstances, then it should be abundantly clear that God could never have created time under any circumstances either. Therefore, all Christians who believe that God could never have created himself, but who also believe that God could still have created time, have a double standard for interpreting and applying the rule that says no thing, whether God or time, can exist and not exist at the very same moment in the very same sense. You apply this rule to God by reasoning, it is impossible for God to exist and not exist at the same moment, therefore God could never have created himself. Yet you refuse to apply this same rule to time by reasoning, but it must be possible for time to exist and not exist at the very same moment, otherwise God could never have created time. This is a clear double standard. And a double standard for reasoning is a logical fallacy of inconsistency, applying rules and criteria to one argument, belief, claim, or position, but not to others. And by definition, a logical fallacy is an instance of incorrect reasoning that creates an invalid form of argument. So at this point, every single one of you who is watching this video at this moment who believes that God could never have created himself, but who also believe that God could still have created time, is not only mistaken in his reasoning, but you have adopted a double standard, a logical fallacy, an instance of incorrect reasoning, and an invalid form of argument. Pardon my redundancy. So give it up. You are simply wrong. God could never have created God could never have created time under any circumstances. But there is another paradox that comes from the idea that God could never have created time. And this paradox has an even closer relationship to the issue of the origin of an eternal God. It turns out that an eternal God couldn't even exist before the existence of time in order to create time to begin with. Because no matter when God would create time, a truly eternal God would have already lived an eternity of time prior to that moment. Otherwise, he wouldn't be eternal. But an eternal God could never be living for millions of years or for any other measure of eternal time prior to creating time in the first place, since for millions of years to pass, time would have to already exist. This paradox also requires time to exist and not exist at the same moment, and therefore also violates the law of non-contradiction. Accordingly, an eternal God could never have even existed before the existence of time. Do you see how we are now getting closer to the issue of the origin of an eternal God? But if God were anything less than eternal before he created time, then God would have to have a beginning. But if God had a beginning, and since there was nothing already in existence from which God could emerge, then God would have to create himself, something that even God could never do, because that would require God himself to exist and not exist at the same moment, creating yet another paradox, which again violates the law of non-contradiction. So neither an eternal God nor a non-eternal God could exist even for a short time before time itself existed in order for God to create time in the first place. This bears repeating. An eternal God could never be living for millions of years before the existence of time, since for millions of years to pass, time would have to already exist. Therefore, it is impossible for an eternal God to exist before the existence of time in order for God to create time in the first place. Okay, are you ready to hear about the origin of God now? Based upon the idea that God could never have created time in the first place, we learn at least 5 amazing things. First, since we know time exists, and since we now know that God could never have created time, then time itself must be uncreated, uncaused, and naturally eternal. Second, since we now know that God could never have created time, then God cannot possibly be the one and only uncaused first cause, because God could never have created time. Third, since we now know that an eternal God could never have even existed before time existed, then God cannot possibly be older than eternal time, and therefore eternal time must be older than God. But if eternal time is older than God, then our eternal God had to have a beginning. Fourth, by definition, only the one and only uncaused first cause never had a beginning. Also, by definition, everything other than the one and only uncaused first cause must have a beginning as an effect of the one and only uncaused first cause. Therefore, since God cannot possibly be the one and only uncaused first cause, because God could never have created time, then God must have a beginning as an effect of the one and only uncaused first cause. Fifth, since our eternal God must have had a beginning, and since eternal time must be older than God, then our eternal God had to come into existence after eternal time, and therefore from eternal time. But if God came from time, then God must be living time, specifically 4-dimensional living space-time, which means that the Trinity must be the living past, the Father, the living present, Jehovah Jesus, and the living future, the Holy Holy Spirit. Another way to arrive at the same conclusion is this. Since God cannot possibly be the uncaused first cause, because God could never have created time, then if God is not the uncaused first cause, what indeed is the uncaused first cause? The uncaused first cause must be something that is uncaused, naturally eternal, that pre-existed God, and that God himself could never have created. Eternal time itself. So as incredible as this sounds, once we accept the idea that time itself is an actual thing, and that God could neither have created time, nor could God have even existed before time existed, the only possible conclusion is that God himself must have come after eternal time, and therefore come from eternal time. Therefore, God must be living time, actually living space-time, and almost by definition, the Trinity must be the living past, the Father, the living present, Jehovah Jesus, and the living future, the Holy Spirit. As far as I can tell, no other possibility exists. Of course, since God could never have created time, Christ would never say, I created the beginning. And since God could never have existed before time, Christ would never say, I existed before the beginning. But as living time, Christ would literally be the beginning. And so it would be only natural for Christ to say, I am the beginning and the end. Revelation 22:13, a statement that strongly suggests, I am literally the beginning and the end, the living past and the living future. This is who and what I actually am, and this is who and what the Trinity actually is, the living past, the living present, and the living future. And since time itself is naturally eternal with no beginning, then I am likewise naturally eternal with no beginning, because I am living time itself. Thus, both logic and the Bible confirm, at least to me, that somehow an eternity ago, inanimate, three-part space-time itself, the past, present, and the future, did indeed become alive as three living beings, the living past, the living present, and the living future. So how do I personally answer the question? How could an eternal God with no beginning ever come into existence in the first place and still be eternal with no beginning? My answer is, mankind should have recognized long ago that only a non-living entity, like time itself, that is already naturally eternal with no beginning, that transitions into being alive, can explain the origin of a living God who is likewise naturally eternal with no beginning. And since eternal time has always existed in three parts, the inanimate past, present, and future, relative to any given point of time, of course, the only possible form of life that could ever arise from time itself must by necessity also exist in those same three parts, and therefore become the living present, i.e. the first part of time itself that became alive, the living past, and the living future, a trinity of living beings existing within one body of eternal time. Since by definition, the first part of time itself that becomes alive, conscious and self-aware, would naturally be considered the relative present, and therefore become the living present, Jehovah Jesus, then, as this aliveness travels forwards and backwards in time like a wave on the ocean, spreading from the present into the eternal past and into the eternal future, then the rest of eternal time would naturally be divided into, and would therefore naturally become, the living past and the living future respectively, the Father and the Holy Spirit. But in addition, even though the living present would be the first part of God to actually become alive, as this aliveness of time travels backwards into all eternity past, God, as the living past, would eventually become completely alive trillions of years before the living present first became alive to begin with. And because this newly alive God is now alive throughout all past eternity and future eternity, we end up with a newly alive, completely eternal God with no beginning at all. Imagine that. A newly alive, eternal God with no beginning. Accordingly, since time itself, the past, present, and future, is naturally eternal with no beginning, then when eternal time transitions from being inanimate into being alive, the resulting newly alive being would likewise be eternal with no beginning, because the living being that is newly alive is in fact eternal time itself with no beginning, and therefore would naturally become the living past, the living present, and the living future, an inseparable trinity without beginning and without end. Mankind should have recognized this self-evident truth centuries ago. Only a non-living entity composed of three inseparable parts, like time itself, that is naturally eternal with no beginning, that transitions into being alive, starting from the relative present, can explain the origin of a living trinity of three inseparable beings who are likewise naturally eternal with no beginning. Consider this. If Siamese triplets were ever to survive, this would be three living beings existing within one human body. Likewise, the Trinity are three living beings existing within one body of eternal four-dimensional space-time. And just like the Siamese triplets can never separate themselves from each other, the Trinity can never separate themselves from each other either. Additionally, just like you can never mechanically separate the past from the present, or separate the present from the future without destroying the nature of time itself, likewise, you can never separate the living past from the living present, or separate the living present from the living future without destroying the Trinity. As I said, this is the only possible origin of the Trinity that would make these three beings become naturally inseparable and still be eternal with no beginning, because time itself is naturally eternal with no beginning. Since this is the only possible answer to the question, then this must be how our eternal God with no beginning originally came into existence. So let me summarize my theory. Time itself is an actual thing, a thing that allows the laws of physics to work, a thing that allows us to age, and a thing that can actually be slowed down by gravity. However, since God could neither have created the thing that is time, nor could God have even existed before time existed, then time itself must have existed before God existed, and so time itself must be uncaused, uncreated, and naturally eternal. Therefore, since God could never have existed before time existed, then God must have come into existence after time existed. But if God came after time, then by default, God must have come from time, which means that God must be living time, specifically four-dimensional living space-time. After all, only a non-living entity like time itself that is naturally eternal with no beginning, that transitions into being alive, can explain the origin of a God who is likewise naturally eternal with no beginning. Accordingly, the Trinity must be the living past, the living present, and the living future. No other possibility exists. That being said, most people will still disagree with my hypothesis, at least initially, for 6 different reasons, especially when I cannot explain it to them in person. First, it's a totally new idea, and most people tend to reject new ideas. Second, it's a wild idea, and even more people reject wild ideas. Third, it's a more complicated idea than simply believing that God has always been eternal with no beginning at all, and therefore more likely to be rejected. Fourth, it appears to be a demeaning idea, because the notion that an eternal God could originally have had a beginning, plus the notion that God could have evolved from time itself, will always be initially perceived as discrediting God's eternal nature, and an even greater number of people tend to reject ideas that are perceived as demeaning their previously cherished ideas. Fifth, it's an idea from a source with unknown credibility, me. Therefore, since my idea is new, wild, complicated, possibly demeaning, and comes from a source of unknown credibility, I expect it to be viewed with skepticism, if not rejected altogether. The sixth reason why many of you might reject my hypothesis that an eternity ago space-time itself became alive is because you simply cannot imagine how space-time could actually become alive in the first place, much less become a conscious, self-aware, loving God. However, you must admit that prior to reading this essay, none of you even thought about this idea one way or the other, much less spent any actual time developing a model of what it would take for a four-dimensional life form that was not made of normal energy and matter to come alive and conscious in the first place. And since you have never even given any thought about this issue, then you may not yet have the proper grounds for rejecting my hypothesis. At least not until you read Essay 2, the essay that explains how four-dimensional space-time itself might actually have become alive. So, just go to uniquebibleanswers.com and read Essay 2 if you like. In Essay 2, I explain why, since gravity affects objects with energy, like planets, moons, comets, and photons, and since gravity can also slow down time, that time itself must have a minute amount of energy at every point in the universe and at every point in time, past, present, and future, totaling to an infinite amount of energy. I explain why the infinite energy of time is probably the same as dark energy, and since dark energy is repulsive energy that can create space and expand the universe, that a long time ago, the energy of eternal time created the space that became space-time. I then present a theoretical model of God's actual body, brain, and mind, and then describe a process by which the infinite repulsive energy of time would naturally create a complex structure made out of pure space. A relatively small but perfectly spherical, slowly expanding space surrounded by trillions of layers of densely compressed folded space that could easily function as a four-dimensional universe-sized information gathering and processing system, which, because it would be powered by the infinite energy of time itself, would inevitably become alive, conscious, all-knowing, all-powerful, but also naturally indifferent. Then, in Essay 3, I do my best to explain why millions of years later, this indifferent, all-powerful God would inevitably become an all-loving, all-powerful God, and explain why such a God would inevitably choose to create and to save mankind. Of course, most people who hear such foreign-sounding ideas will simply dismiss them out of hand without creating a well-thought-out rebuttal. But dismissing an idea without providing an actual rebuttal is not a refutation. Whenever you deliberately dismiss your opponent's proposition without a rebuttal in order to come to a conclusion that avoids the influence of your opponent's evidence, you're actually committing a logical fallacy, specifically a fallacy of exclusion. Important evidence that would refute an argument is deliberately excluded from consideration. In this case, it is the important evidence that completely refutes the traditional Christian belief that God created time that is being deliberately excluded from consideration without any actual refutation, a classic fallacy of exclusion. And by definition, a logical fallacy is an instance of incorrect reasoning that creates an invalid form of argument. So if you disagree with my conclusion that God is living time, specifically four-dimensional living spacetime, and you still would like to refute my idea without simply dismissing my idea and committing a logical fallacy of exclusion, then you must create a well-thought-out rebuttal, even if it's just in your own mind. To do this, you must also go to my website, uniquebibleanswers.com, and read Essay 1B. You'll see why when you get there. Thank you very much for listening. Again, This is David King, and this is the screenshot page of Unique Bible Answers, non-traditional answers to common Bible questions. Thank you again.